Detective Jack Brennan slammed his fist on the desk, scattering papers across the worn surface. The precinct buzzed around him, but he barely registered the noise. 3 weeks into the Riverside Park murder case, and they were no closer to catching the killer. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. A soft knock on his office door made him look up. Officer Chen stood in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "What is it, Chen?" Brennan barked. "Sir, there's a woman here. Says she has information about the Riverside case." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you say so earlier? Send her in." Chen stepped aside, revealing a young black woman. She entered the office, her posture straight, but her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Have a seat," Brennan said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Name?" "Aisha Johnson," she replied, perching on the edge of the seat. Brennan sized her up. Early 20s, well-dressed, but clearly uncomfortable. He'd seen her type before, probably some college kid looking for attention. "What information do you have, Miss Johnson?" Aisha leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "I was in the park that night. I saw something." Brennan's eyebrow arched. "And you're just coming forward now?" "I was scared," she admitted, "but I can't stay silent anymore. I saw a man leaving the area where the body was found. He was covered in blood." Brennan leaned back in his chair, skepticism etched on his face. "Lots of people were in the park that night. How do you know what you saw was related to the murder?" Aisha's eyes flashed. "Because I'm not blind, Detective. The man I saw matches your suspect description perfectly. White male, mid-30s, scar on his left cheek." Brennan's jaw tightened. The scar detail hadn't been released to the public, but something didn't sit right. Why would a key witness wait so long to come forward? "Miss Johnson, do you realize how serious this is? Making false statements to the police?" "False statements?" Aisha interrupted, her voice rising. "I'm telling you what I saw!" Brennan stood, towering over her. "Listen, I don't have time for games. If you're looking for your 15 minutes of fame, find it somewhere else. We're done here." Aisha rose, her hands shaking but her gaze steady. "You're dismissing me because I'm black, aren't you?" The accusation hung in the air. Brennan's face hardened. "I'm dismissing you because your story doesn't add up. Now, if you have nothing else to add, Officer Chen will show you out." As Aisha left, Brennan turned to the case board, pushing her words from his mind. He had real leads to follow, not wild stories from attention seekers. Chen lingered in the doorway, her expression troubled. "Detective, are you sure about this? She seemed pretty convincing to me." Brennan shot her a sharp look. "You questioning my judgment, Chen?" "No, sir," she replied quickly, but her eyes told a different story. "Good. Now get back to work. We've got a killer to catch." As Chen left, Brennan sank back into his chair, his eyes scanning the crime scene photos pinned to the board. The victim, Sarah Keller, 28, found strangled in Riverside Park. No witnesses, no DNA, nothing but a vague description from a jogger who'd seen a man fleeing the scene. He rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of another tension headache. This case was going nowhere fast, and the brass was breathing down his neck for results. He didn't have time for wild goose chases or publicity seekers. But as he stared at the photos, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. What if he was wrong? What if Aisha Johnson had really seen something? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. No, his instincts had never led him astray before. He'd been on the force for 20 years, had closed more cases than anyone else in the precinct. He knew how to read people, how to spot a liar. Still, as he turned back to his paperwork, he couldn't quite shake the image of Aisha's steady gaze, the conviction in her voice. The next morning, Brennan arrived at the precinct early, dark circles under his eyes, testament to another sleepless night. He'd barely set his coffee down when Captain Rivera's voice boomed across the bullpen. "Brennan, my office now!" Brennan sighed, straightening his tie as he made his way to the captain's office. This couldn't be good. Rivera was waiting for him, his face set in a grim expression. "Close the door," he said as Brennan entered. Brennan did as he was told, then stood before the captain's desk, hands clasped behind his back. "What's this I hear about you turning away a witness yesterday?" Rivera asked, his tone deceptively calm. Brennan's stomach clenched. How had the captain heard about that? "Sir, it wasn't a credible lead. The woman's story didn't add up." Rivera leaned back in his chair, fixing Brennan with a hard stare. "And you're sure about that? Because I've got the DA breathing down my neck saying we're not following up on all leads." "The DA?" Brennan frowned. How did they even hear about this? Apparently, Miss Johnson wasn't satisfied with your response. She went straight to the DA's office with her story. Brennan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was bad. If the DA got involved, the whole case could be compromised. Sir, I can explain. Rivera held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it, Brennan. I don't want explanations. I want results. You're going to bring this woman back in, hear her out properly, and follow up on every detail she gives you. Is that clear? Brennan clenched his jaw, swallowing his pride. Yes, sir. As he turned to leave, Rivera's voice stopped him. And Brennan, if I hear one more complaint about you dismissing witnesses based on personal biases, we're going to have a much more serious conversation. Understood? Brennan nodded stiffly, then left the office, his mind racing. He had to fix this, and fast. Brennan sat in his car outside Aisha Johnson's apartment building, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the steering wheel. He'd spent the better part of the morning tracking her down, swallowing his pride with each phone call and database search. Get it together, Jack, he muttered to himself, finally stepping out of the vehicle. The lobby was dingy, with flickering fluorescent lights that gave everything a sickly pallor. Brennan checked the apartment number again, 3B, and started up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. He paused outside her door, took a deep breath, and knocked. For a long moment there was silence. Then, just as he was about to knock again, he heard movement inside. The door opened a crack, revealing Aisha's face. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. Detective Brennan, she said, her voice cool. What do you want? Brennan cleared his throat. Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. I was wondering if we could talk. Aisha studied him for a moment, then opened the door wider. 5 minutes, she said, stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was small but tidy, with textbooks stacked on a coffee table and a laptop open on the couch. Brennan noticed a framed diploma on the wall. She was a law student. Nice place, he said, attempting to break the ice. Aisha crossed her arms. You didn't come here to comment on my decor, detective. What do you want? Brennan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I messed up. I shouldn't have dismissed you like that yesterday. I'd like to hear your story again if you're willing to tell it. Aisha's eyebrows shot up. And why should I bother? You made it pretty clear you think I'm just some attention seeker. The words stung, but Brennan knew he deserved them. You're right. I made assumptions and that was wrong. But this isn't about me. There's a killer out there, and if you really saw something, we need to know. Aisha considered this for a moment, then gestured to the couch. Sit down, she said, taking a seat in the armchair opposite. Brennan sat, pulling out his notebook. Okay, Miss Johnson, let's start from the beginning. What exactly did you see that night? Aisha took a deep breath. I was in the park late, studying. There's a bench near the fountain where I like to go when I need some fresh air. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I heard something. A scuffle, I think. Brennan nodded, jotting down notes. And what did you do? I didn't do anything at first. I thought it might just be some kids messing around. But then I heard a scream. It was awful. Aisha shuddered at the memory. Did you see the victim? Brennan asked, his voice gentler now. Aisha shook her head. No, the sound came from behind some bushes. I was scared. I started to pack up my things, thinking I should leave. That's when I saw him. The man you mentioned before? Yes. He came out from behind the bushes. He was breathing hard, looking around like he was making sure no one had seen him. That's when I noticed the blood on his shirt. Brennan leaned forward. And you're sure about the scar on his left cheek? Aisha nodded firmly. Positive. It was distinctive, kind of jagged, like a knife wound. Brennan's mind raced. The detail about the scar matched what they'd pieced together from other witness statements, but no one else had gotten such a clear look at the suspect. Miss Johnson, why didn't you come forward sooner? He asked, trying to keep any hint of accusation out of his voice. Aisha's eyes dropped to her hands. I was scared. I've seen how these things can go wrong. A black witness in a high-profile case? I didn't want to get involved. But then I saw the news about the woman who was killed. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Brennan felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he dismissed witnesses like Aisha, assuming they were unreliable or had ulterior motives? I understand, he said quietly. And I'm sorry for how I treated you yesterday. Your information could be crucial to this case. Aisha looked up, meeting his gaze. So what happens now? Brennan stood, pocketing his notebook. Now we get to work. I'd like you to come down to the station, work with a sketch artist. If we can get a composite of this guy, it could help us track him down. Aisha nodded, a hint of a smile on her face. Okay, I can do that. As they headed for the door, Brennan turned to her. Thank you, Miss Johnson, for coming forward and for giving me a second chance. I'm not doing it for you, Detective, Aisha replied, her voice firm. I'm doing it for Sarah Keller and for anyone else this man might hurt if he's not caught. Brennan nodded, a newfound respect for the young woman growing in his chest. Then let's make sure we catch him. As they left the apartment, Brennan felt a shift in his perspective. He'd nearly blown off a key witness because of his own biases. It was a mistake he couldn't afford to make again, not if he wanted to solve this case and bring a killer to justice. The precinct buzzed with renewed energy as Brennan pinned the new composite sketch to the caseboard. Aisha's detailed description had given them their best lead yet, a clear image of a man with a distinctive scar on his left cheek, eyes cold and calculating. All right, listen up, Brennan called out, gathering the team around him. This is our guy. I want this sketch circulated to every precinct, every news outlet. Someone out there knows this man. As the detectives dispersed to carry out his orders, Brennan felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Officer Chen, a concerned look on her face. Detective, there's something you should know, she said, her voice low. Some of the guys, they're not happy about how this lead came in. Brennan's jaw tightened. Meaning what, exactly? Chen glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. They're saying you caved to pressure from the DA's office, that you're letting politics dictate the investigation. Politics? Brennan scoffed. Following up on a credible witness statement is just good police work. I know that, sir, Chen replied. But after you dismissed Miss Johnson initially, well, it's caused some talk. Brennan ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his mistake. Thanks for the heads up, Chen. I'll handle it. As Chen walked away, Brennan noticed the side eyes and hushed conversations around the bullpen. He'd been so focused on making things right with Aisha that he hadn't considered how his abrupt change of course would be perceived by his colleagues. Before he could dwell on it further, Captain Rivera's voice boomed across the room. Brennan, a word. Brennan steeled himself as he entered the captain's office, closing the door behind him. Rivera leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I hear we've got a new lead. Yes, sir, Brennan replied. Miss Johnson's statement has given us a solid description of our suspect. We're circulating the sketch now. Rivera nodded slowly. And you're sure about this? Yesterday you were ready to write her off completely. Brennan felt his face flush with embarrassment. I made a mistake, Captain. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, Rivera said sharply. Then his tone softening slightly, he added, Look, Jack, you're a good detective, one of my best. But this case is high profile, and we can't afford any more missteps. The brass is watching us closely. Understood, sir, Brennan replied, fighting to keep the frustration out of his voice. Is that all? Rivera hesitated, then sighed. There's one more thing. The DA's office wants to assign one of their investigators to the case, to ensure we're following all leads properly. Brennan felt his blood begin to boil. You've got to be kidding me. We don't need a babysitter from the DA's office looking over our shoulders. It's not up for debate, Jack, Rivera said firmly. They'll be here tomorrow morning. I expect you to give them your full cooperation. Brennan left the captain's office, his mind racing. He had to solve this case, and fast, not just for the victim, but to prove to everyone, including himself, that he was still the detective he'd always prided himself on being. He was so lost in thought that he almost bumped into Aisha, who was waiting by his desk. Miss Johnson, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't realize you were still here. Aisha held up a small notebook. I've been thinking about that night, trying to remember any other details that might help. I wrote some things down. Brennan felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you. That's really helpful. As they sat down to go over her notes, Brennan couldn't help but notice the curious glances from his fellow officers. He knew what they were thinking, that he was getting too close to a witness, that he was overcompensating for his initial mistake. But as Aisha described the sound of the suspect's footsteps, The way he'd looked over his shoulder as he fled the scene, Brennan knew he was on the right track. This was the break they needed. Suddenly, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A man was shouting, struggling against two officers who were trying to restrain him. "I'm telling you, I know that guy," the man yelled, pointing at the composite sketch on the caseboard. "That's my neighbor, Mike Rollins." Brennan was on his feet in an instant, rushing towards the scene. As he approached, he saw the man's eyes widen in recognition. "You're the detective, right?" the man said, his voice urgent. "You gotta listen to me. That guy, Mike, he's always been weird, but lately he's been acting real strange, coming and going at all hours, looking all nervous like." Brennan felt his heart rate quicken. This could be it. The break they'd been waiting for. He turned to the officers restraining the man. "Let him go," he ordered. "Sir, I'm Detective Brennan. I need you to come with me and tell me everything you know about Mike Rollins." As Brennan led the man to an interview room, he caught Aisha's eye across the bullpen. She gave him a small nod, a look of cautious hope on her face. For the first time since the case began, Brennan felt a glimmer of optimism. They were close. He could feel it. And he owed it all to the witness he'd almost turned away. The squad car's tires screeched as Brennan pulled up to the curb, his eyes scanning the dilapidated apartment complex before him. Mike Rollins' last known address loomed like a fortress of secrets, its weathered brick facade hiding who knew what horrors within. "Chen, take the back," Brennan ordered as they exited the vehicle. "Williams, you're with me." As they approached the building, Brennan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, mixed with an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything hinged on this moment: the case, his career, his very understanding of himself as a detective. Just as they reached the entrance, Brennan's phone buzzed. Aisha's name flashed on the screen. "Johnson, what is it?" he answered, his voice tense. "Detective, I remembered something else," Aisha said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The night of the murder, I saw the suspect drop something as he was leaving. It looked like a keychain with a distinctive logo, a red dragon." Brennan's mind raced. A red dragon keychain hadn't been found at the crime scene, but if Rollins still had it, it could be crucial evidence. "Good work, Johnson," he said. "We're about to enter the suspect's apartment now. I'll keep an eye out for it." As he hung up, William shot him a questioning look. "Since when do we take mid-raid calls from witnesses?" Brennan ignored the jab, focusing on the task at hand. "Let's move." They climbed the stairs to the third floor, the musty smell of the building filling their nostrils. Outside apartment 3C, Brennan took a deep breath, then pounded on the door. "Mike Rollins, this is the police. Open up!" Silence. Brennan nodded to Williams, who took a step back and then rammed his shoulder into the door. It splintered open with a crack. The apartment was a mess of takeout containers and dirty laundry. But what caught Brennan's eye was the wall opposite the entrance, covered in newspaper clippings about the Riverside Park murder, photos of the crime scene, and in the center, a large map of the park with various locations circled in red. "Holy shit," Williams breathed. Brennan's radio crackled to life. "Detective," Chen's voice came through. "Suspect spotted fleeing through the back alley. In pursuit now." "Copy that," Brennan replied, already moving. "Williams, secure the scene. Call for backup in CSU." Brennan thundered down the stairs, his heart pounding in his ears. As he burst out of the back entrance, he caught a glimpse of Chen rounding a corner, in hot pursuit of a figure in a dark hoodie. The chase led them through a maze of alleys, the suspect always just out of reach. Brennan's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, determined not to let Rollins slip away. Suddenly, the alley opened up into a small park. The suspect, now clearly visible as a man matching Rollins's description, stumbled on the uneven ground. It was the opening Brennan needed. He launched himself forward, tackling Rollins to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, Brennan struggling to subdue the surprisingly strong suspect. "Stop resisting," Brennan grunted, finally managing to pin Rollins's arms behind his back. As he slapped the handcuffs on, something caught his eye. A keychain had fallen from Rollins' pocket. A red dragon glinted in the afternoon sun. Chen jogged up, breathing heavily. "Nice takedown, detective." Brennan nodded, still catching his breath. He picked up the keychain, a grim smile of satisfaction on his face. "Call it in, Chen. We got him." Back at the precinct, the mood was electric. Officers patted Brennan on the back as he walked Rollins to the interrogation room, congratulating him on the arrest. But Brennan's mind was elsewhere. As he passed his desk, he saw Aisha waiting, a mix of anticipation and concern on her face. "We got him," Brennan said simply. Aisha's eyes widened. "The keychain?" Brennan held it up, watching as relief washed over her features. "Your tip made the difference. We found a virtual shrine to the murder in his apartment. This guy's our killer, no doubt about it." Aisha nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'm glad I could help." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the past few days hanging between them. Then Brennan cleared his throat. "Listen, Johnson. Aisha, I owe you more than just an apology. You broke this case wide open, and if I had listened to you from the start—" Aisha held up a hand, cutting him off. "Detective, you did listen. Eventually. That's what matters." Brennan shook his head. "No, it's not enough. I need you to know that I'm going to do better. Not just on this case, but moving forward. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's not the kind of cop I want to be." Aisha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because there are a lot of people out there who need cops they can trust. People who need to be heard." "I hear you," Brennan said, the double meaning not lost on him. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a confession to get." As he walked towards the interrogation room, Brennan felt a shift within himself. He had always prided himself on being a good detective, but now he realized that being truly good at his job meant more than just closing cases. It meant being open, being fair, and sometimes admitting when you're wrong. The keychain felt heavy in his pocket, a small object that had changed so much. As he opened the door to face Rollins, Brennan silently thanked Aisha once more, not just for breaking the case, but for breaking through his own preconceptions. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with tension as Brennan sat across from Mike Rollins. The suspect's eyes darted around the room, his fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on the table. "So, Mike," Brennan began, his voice calm but firm, "want to tell me about Sarah Keller?" Rollins's eyes snapped to Brennan's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Brennan leaned back, letting the silence stretch. He'd done this dance countless times before, but something felt different now. He was acutely aware of his own assumptions, his own biases. He needed to be better. "That's interesting," Brennan finally said, pulling out the red dragon keychain, "because we found this at the crime scene, and in your pocket when we arrested you." Rollins's face paled, his fingers stilling on the table. "We also found quite the collection in your apartment," Brennan continued. "Newspaper clippings, photos of the crime scene. You seemed pretty interested in this case, Mike." Rollins swallowed hard. "That doesn't prove anything. Maybe I'm just fascinated by true crime." Brennan nodded, as if considering this. "Maybe. Or maybe you're fascinated because you're the one who committed the crime." He pulled out a file, laying out photos of Sarah Keller, alive, smiling, and then the grim crime scene photos. Rollins flinched, looking away. "Here's what I think happened, Mike," Brennan said, his voice low and intense. "You saw Sarah in the park that night. Maybe you'd seen her there before, watched her, but this time something snapped. You attacked her, strangled her, but you made a mistake. Someone saw you fleeing the scene." Rollins' head snapped up, fear evident in his eyes. "Someone saw me?" Brennan nodded, thinking of Aisha. "We have an eyewitness who can place you at the scene, covered in blood. Game over, Mike." The room fell silent, the only sound Rollins' ragged breathing. Then, like a dam breaking, the words started pouring out. "I didn't mean to kill her," Rollins sobbed, his facade crumbling. "I just wanted to talk to her, but she screamed, and I panicked." As Rollins confessed, Brennan felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Another case closed, another killer off the streets. But at what cost? Sarah Keller was still dead, her family still shattered. Hours later, as Brennan finished typing up his report, he noticed Aisha hovering near his desk. "It's done," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Rollins confessed. He's going away for a long time." Aisha nodded, relief evident on her face. "Good. I'm glad I could help bring him to justice." Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You did more than that, Aisha. You taught me a valuable lesson." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I've been a cop for over 20 years, Brennan said, his voice thoughtful. "I thought I had seen it all. knew it all. But I realized I've been looking at things through a very narrow lens. I almost let a killer walk free because I couldn't see past my own preconceptions. Aisha's expression softened. Recognition is the first step, detective. What matters is what you do next. Brennan nodded, a determined look in his eyes. I'm going to do better, starting with recommending some changes in our witness interview procedures. We need to make sure every voice is heard, every lead followed, regardless of who it comes from. That's a good start, Aisha said with a small smile. As she stood to leave, Brennan called out, Aisha, wait, I know you're in law school. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement? We could use more perspectives like yours. Aisha paused, considering. I'll think about it, detective. For now, I'm just glad I could make a difference. As Brennan watched her leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He turned back to his computer, pulling up the department's training protocols. It was time for some changes. The next morning, Brennan stood before Captain Rivera, his proposal in hand. You want to overhaul our witness interview procedures? Rivera asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Brennan nodded firmly. Yes, sir. I believe it's necessary to ensure we're not missing crucial information due to unconscious biases. Rivera leaned back in his chair, studying Brennan. This wouldn't have anything to do with your initial dismissal of Miss Johnson, would it? It has everything to do with that, Brennan admitted. I made a mistake, Captain. A mistake that could have cost us the case. We can't afford to let that happen again. Rivera was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Brennan. Draft up a formal proposal. We'll present it to the brass next week. As Brennan left the office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was a small step, but an important one. He knew there was still a long way to go, both for himself and for the department, but he was committed to making that journey. He glanced at the caseboard as he passed, Sarah Keller's photo still pinned in the center. We did it, he murmured. And we'll do better next time. With that promise echoing in his mind, Detective Jack Brennan turned to face the new day, ready to be the cop he should have been all along. 6 months later, Detective Jack Brennan stood at the back of the precinct's largest conference room, watching as officers filed in for the mandatory training session. The room buzzed with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Change never came easy, especially in a department as set in its ways as theirs. As the last few stragglers took their seats, Brennan caught sight of a familiar face entering the room. Aisha Johnson, now interning with the DA's office, gave him a small nod as she made her way to the front of the room. Captain Rivera cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs. All right, everyone. As you know, we've been implementing new procedures for witness interviews and lead follow-ups. Today, we have a special guest to help us understand why these changes are so crucial. Brennan felt a surge of pride as Aisha stepped forward, her posture confident, her gaze steady as she surveyed the room. Good morning, she began, her voice clear and strong. I'm Aisha Johnson, and 6 months ago I was a witness in the Riverside Park murder case. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. The case had made headlines not just for its resolution, but for the internal changes it had sparked within the department. I'm here today to share my experience, Aisha continued, and to help you understand the importance of listening to every witness, regardless of their background or appearance. As Aisha recounted her story, from being dismissed by Brennan to ultimately providing the key evidence that cracked the case, Brennan found himself transported back to those tense days. He could see the younger officers leaning forward, hanging on Aisha's every word, while some of the veterans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When Aisha finished, Rivera stepped forward again. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, he said, his tone firm. It's about recognizing our blind spots and doing better. Detective Brennan? Brennan straightened, making his way to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of his colleagues' gazes, some supportive, others wary. What happened in the Riverside Park case was a wake-up call, Brennan began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. I've been a cop for over 2 decades, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about this job, but I was wrong. He paused, making eye contact with various officers around the room. Our biases, whether we're aware of them or not, can cloud our judgment. They can make us miss crucial evidence, dismiss key witnesses, and ultimately fail in our duty to serve and protect all members of our community. Brennan could see some officers nodding in agreement, while others remained stoic. He pressed on. The new procedures we're implementing aren't just bureaucratic red tape. They're tools to help us be better cops, to ensure we're giving every case, every witness, every victim the attention they deserve. It's not always easy to confront our own biases, but it's necessary if we want to truly uphold justice. As the training session continued, with Brennan and Aisha leading discussions on real-world scenarios, he could sense a shift in the room. The initial skepticism was giving way to engagement, with officers asking questions and sharing their own experiences. Hours later, as the session wrapped up, Brennan found himself cornered by a group of younger officers, eager to discuss the new approaches. Their enthusiasm was infectious, reminding him of his own early days on the force. "Detective Brennan?" A voice cut through the chatter. Brennan turned to see Officer Chen, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I just wanted to say thank you for admitting you were wrong, for pushing for these changes. It can't have been easy." Brennan felt a lump form in his throat. "No, it wasn't," he admitted. "But it was necessary. We owe it to the people we serve to be the best cops we can be." As the room emptied, Brennan found himself alone with Aisha. She was gathering her notes, a small smile playing at her lips. "That went well," Brennan said, leaning against a nearby desk. Aisha nodded. "Better than I expected, honestly, though I think you might have some work ahead of you with some of the old guard." Brennan chuckled. "Change takes time, but we'll get there." "We?" Aisha raised an eyebrow. "Well," Brennan said, a hint of mischief in his eyes, "I was hoping you might consider coming on board more permanently. The DA's office is great, but we could really use someone like you here, helping to shape the future of the department." Aisha's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you offering me a job, Detective?" "More like extending an invitation," Brennan replied, "to help us continue this work, to make sure we keep moving in the right direction." Aisha was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she smiled, extending her hand. "I'll think about it. In the meantime, partners?" Brennan took her hand, shaking it firmly. "Partners." As they left the conference room together, Brennan felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. The precinct bustled around them, a microcosm of the city they served, diverse, complex, sometimes messy, but always full of potential. And as Brennan watched Aisha navigate the hallways with growing confidence, he knew that the future of law enforcement was in good hands. The case that had nearly broken him had instead remade him, opening his eyes to new perspectives and possibilities. As he settled in at his desk, ready to tackle the day's cases with fresh eyes and an open mind, Detective Jack Brennan felt, for the first time in years, that he was truly living up to his badge.